Okay. Kasa kai Mumbai? Awesome. Yeah, that's the part of Marathi that I know. Yeah, how was lunch? Everyone had a very good lunch? Yeah? And also a reminder, no sleeping time now. How many of you are using serverless? Building out Lambda functions, okay? How many of you deploy these Lambda functions into production? How many of you see these Lambda functions breaking in production? That's less hands. Like, come on, you're building so many Lambda functions, having it in production, but they're not failing? Something's wrong. Well, I'll be talking to you about a few of the best practices that you can do, especially to identify when something goes wrong, when your production breaks, using something called as Lambda PowerTools. Have you heard about Lambda PowerTools? That's two hands, and I know they know it. Okay, so without a further ado, who am I? I am Jones, one of the AWS serverless heroes based out of Bangalore, India. And I do a lot of things around serverless, like I write a lot of stuff, talk a lot of stuff, and also publish a lot of stuff around serverless. Not just that, I am also one of the developer relations engineer at Neuralink. So not just limited to serverless, I talk about observability as well. Feel free to use the QR code to connect with me if you have any questions around observability, cloud, or even anything general, or even recommending me where to have a vada pav later in the night. Today, I'll be speaking about the problem with respect to serverless and observability, how PowerTools can help you. PowerTools has things called as utils, where I'll be talking about the logger, metrics, and tracers. And of course, if you're using something more advanced, more specific observability tools, how it can all play together. You may have heard talks today, which basically means serverless is awesome. Like, yeah, Albus Dumbledore approves it. So, yes, serverless is awesome. You don't have to pay for your idle time, don't have to worry about scalability, don't have to worry about infrastructure. Just focus on your business needs, and that should be good. Yes, but your business needs, the logic in your business needs can break things too. And you are responsible to identify them and fix them. So what happens when something breaks in production, right? Most of us, I saw less hands, but generally when things break in production, how many of you face that issue? Not just with Lambda functions, across different stacks. Okay, now that's a lot of hands. So when something breaks in production, the common thing is we say, hey, it should be fine, it should be fine, it should be fine, and we console our own selves. We tend to go in and understand what went wrong. And this is where something like observability helps. So let's get debugging when something goes wrong, and we want to identify what went wrong. With Lambda functions, we tend to understand it, but sometimes we don't. And most of the times we relate to how EC2 works, how container works, but Lambda functions is not like that. It works a little different. So by nature, Lambda functions are ephemeral, so you don't have access to the environment after the execution, after the container has been destroyed. And when you're looking at certain errors or looking to simulate certain errors, that's not possible always. You don't have control to the underlying infrastructure. How many of you know that Lambda is being powered by something called as Firecracker? Okay, that's the hands that I know who knew that thing. But we don't have access to Firecracker as developers. So you cannot control how they work or look into insights about what really happened during the course of execution. You have very limited visibility into these containers. Morning, Lewis was talking a lot about performance testing. So when you perform that kind of stress test, load test, or whatnot, you need to have access, you need to have visibility about what went wrong. With Lambda, it's a little different. So how do you do it, right? Again, going with the best practices with Lambda functions, what we do is we break a monolith into hundreds of task-specific functions, and that's the best practice with Lambda functions, which also makes it a very complex architecture for you as developers to identify what's happening more in terms of microservices mindset, to identify, okay, this is specific service that's happening, but in the traditional world, I would have a container do this, but you will have 10 lambdas, the same task broken into 10 different lambdas to perform a similar service, right? Which makes it hard, which makes it difficult for you to identify what went wrong in that service holistically. Also, there's a fact about bringing in certain best practices with different kinds of frameworks. So there's no boilerplate framework available unless you use certain things like the starter guides that the IAC providers have today. But they are not enough, or you may not need, it may not fit the needs of what your organization needs, right? How many of us have compliances that we'll have to ensure that the logs are structured in certain formats because that's what our organization needs? Or even to the factor of telling in that, okay, I don't log certain kinds of information or identify certain PII kind of information, right? With bringing in certain practices into Lambda, when you have hundreds of Lambda in your ecosystem doing these things, it could be hard. This is where you bring in tools. This is where you bring in frameworks. And that is what I'll be talking about today. You don't have to go into a God mode and hand coding a lot of these things, because that's what the tools are for. That's what the utility tools are for. What is PowerTools for AWS Lambda, or AWS Lambda PowerTools? It's used interchangeably, so I'll probably say it as PowerTools for AWS Lambda or AWS Lambda PowerTools. AWS Lambda PowerTools is an open source utility tool that is built by the AWS team, where it follows the best practices that the well-architected framework talks about. Have you heard about the well-architected tool? Okay, that's not a lot of hands. So TLDR about what well-architected tool is: it has different pillars that enforces you to follow the best practices so that your application is well-architected, be it in terms of telling in how do you enforce security, how do you bring in maintainability, how do you bring in monitoring and observability, how do you enforce certain coding standards, all of them, and that's the well-architected tool, TLDR. So the PowerTools brings in these kind of well-architected tool for serverless and enforcing you to build with those well-architected recommendations, so that when your applications go into production, they are following the best practices. How many of us want that? Come on, that's not a lot of hands. We don't want best practices? Oh, that's bad. But this is a serverless toolkit which enables you to do it. And it's available for different programming languages like Python. How many of you are Python developers? Okay, .NET, Java. Oh, okay. So it's and Node.js or TypeScript. It's available in these runtimes where you can just import the PowerTools library and get started with it. I'll be talking to you about more of how do you do that, but why do you use PowerTools, right? When I mentioned that something goes wrong, how do you identify them? That's where observability comes into picture. If you attended Manoj's session, he talked something about idempotency, where you ensure that the Lambda function does not, or they are not repetitive invocations of your Lambda functions, right? Bringing that resilience for your Lambda functions. And also the question about maintainability. How maintainable are your Lambda functions? So PowerTools enables you with all of it, but in the interest of time, I'll be focusing only on observability and monitoring. How many of us are familiar with observability? Like logs, metrics, traces, the three words that you always hear every time somebody talks about observability. Like, I'll be repeatedly using it, so don't blame me. That's something that you use when you're talking about observability. When you talk about logs, metrics, traces, logs are just certain information about how or when these invocation or executions happened in your environments. Metrics are just aggregation of how they're performing, and traces are the complete invocation cycle or the trace or the steps that the invocation followed across different functions, different microservices, all of it together. So when you talk about these things, these three pillars of observability, how does PowerTools fit in? PowerTools has a bunch of utilities. When we talk about observability and monitoring, there is Logger, which brings in the logging best practices. There is metrics that enables you with creating more metrics on CloudWatch, and also traces, which creates traces in the way you want it, bringing the best practices, and also having more information for these traces on X-ray. With PowerTools, the three utilities, Logger, metrics, and tracer, is something I'll deep dive into. The first one being logs. How many of us have programmed our languages with, say, console.log, hello world, or console.log, hey, this function completed, or response, receive response, or response 200, right? Is that enough? No? Or all of you are happy with that kind of logs? Yes? No? Maybe? That's silent. I take silent as yes, but I don't want to take a yes for this. Well, this is something that you don't want, because when you're taking a look at logs, there's a huge dump of logs, especially when you just open CloudWatch log groups and see an invocation for, say, 10 minutes in your production application. It's a lot of logs, and just having a statement is not enough always. Maybe it's good enough to identify, okay, a certain part of your function or certain part of your system worked, didn't work, but it's not enough to identify when or what really happened. So having more information for your logs is necessary. And also having information about what kind of log this is. With logs, you can set up different kinds of levels, be it info, debug, errors, warning, critical, all of them. So that when you look at errors, you know what kind or what nature is this log about, right? How many of us just use console log and it just creates info logs? Maybe you have a try catch, you have exception handling, and you are trying to create a log for it. When it does create a log, it is by default info, which is not really helpful, because when you're scanning through a list of information, you tend to ignore the info logs because they are just the good logs or the happy parts that happen. That's why creating different kinds of log levels or using them in your application is much needed, where you can say the exception ones are log.error or warnings or critical based on the nature of it. And also when you're debugging, you want to have some debug logs. So let us not restrict ourselves with info logs alone. And with PowerTools, when you are importing them, you import the logger utility and you can set the default level of the logs. And when you're logging them, you could, by default, it follows the default one. Otherwise, you can also set them dynamic for that one specific log alone. So here is one such example where I did a Lambda function invocation. It did run well. There was the complete function executed. I got a response. It generated a bunch of logs, and this is one such example. So I'm using PowerTools logger here, where I'm setting it as info, and I'm adding in more information for my logs, telling in what path did it follow, what HTTP method did it follow. I know most of you at the back may not be able to see it clearly, but the highlighted parts are those additional attributes that you configured on your own Lambda function by adding them as metadata or attributes into your logs, so that when you look at it, when you identify, okay, this is the log that I want to look at, you get those metadata readily. And also, not just with your Lambda function source code, but also when you're using the environment variables that Lambda function offers, you can set what service it is. Basically, we use Lambda functions as part of a microservice or a backend system or whatever, right? And defining what that service is really important, especially if you have Lambda functions across multiple microservices. And you want to identify which service, what went wrong, which invocation was this? Was this a cold start? Was this information about how do I check the path of invocation? Be it in terms where you have a Lambda resolver for your AppSync APIs or your REST APIs, and this is being invoked by two different methods or two different paths. You want to identify which path caused this error, because most likely it is the data that's causing the error or the repeated invocation that's causing the error, or even in terms of misconfigurations with your path and the handler. So with PowerTools, you can create attributes which are really informative for your logs and when you're trying to debug a production issue. Not just extra information that you can add, PowerTools also adds certain things automatically, right? Most of the times, we encounter cold starts with Lambda functions, and you want to identify which are those cold starts. For most business critical issues, cold start is still a big thing today, right? And PowerTools, by default, adds if that invocation was a cold start with a Boolean value into your logs. So when you're taking a look at the logs, you know this was because of a cold start. Some issues could happen just because it's a cold start invocation. And when you test it out, following all the practices that Lewis was mentioning, cold start may never occur for whatever reason, right? And you may never encounter this during your testing phase, but it breaks in production. So having certain information telling, okay, it's cold start, or it could even be because you have a misconfigured error size, or the Lambda function needed more memory, and it failed because of it. So PowerTools, by default, adds or injects these information into your logs as attributes. With the JSON structure that it creates, you can take a look at them or query them, even with Insights query or anything such, so that you can easily identify which are these logs. Also, when you're invoking Lambda functions with different kinds of invokers or triggers, Lambda functions could be invoked by a bunch of them. Like technically all almost every other AWS service, but you want to know if your Lambda function errored out because it was invoked from AppSync or API Gateway, IoT Core, or whatnot, or even Event Bridge or another Lambda function. Because all of these send in different payloads or different event messages that are there. And they could break just because it's a different payload, right? So you can create correlation IDs with PowerTools, where going into the session, I'll also be talking about tracers, where how correlation ID with tracers can stitch the complete information for you. Most of the times, we may want to add certain more information than just what is configured dynamically. Say, for example, if we have certain information that has to be logged and only specific logs, and certain of them should not have them, you can dynamically append or even remove certain keys from the JSON structure that PowerTools creates. So with Logger, you could use these snippets where if you want to dynamically add them, use the append keys. If you want to remove, just remove keys. And if you want to have a default state or the default parameters in your PowerTools, just clear the state and log your logs. How many of us always see info logs and think that's too much of information? PowerTools has something called as advanced logging controls, where you can set a specific level of logs, where whenever it's logging them and it goes into your CloudWatch logs, it ensures that anything below the error log level. So if you remember from one of the slides that I had different levels, like from critical to info, you can define these logs and say anything below debug or below info, I don't want to log them because it's just noise for me to look at when I'm debugging in my production. With the advanced control tools, what it does internally is complex workflow, but what it does generally is you can set a specific error level, and when it sees any message that's below that error level, it ignores it and it doesn't logs it on your CloudWatch logs. So you can define what is that error level and you can just ignore the rest, making it efficient enough for you to look at errors or warnings or something that's more of importance for you, especially while debugging. When we are working with exceptions, we just don't want an error message with our logs. We want more information. And the logger utility has something specific for exceptions, where with the exceptions, it injects the stack trace that it followed and also information about the traces that it is there, so that when you take a look at the log, you can see a huge green area here, which is basically the stack trace that the logger utility of PowerTools injected into my log, and I didn't have to do anything. So when something goes wrong, I don't have to double down or understand, okay, this is technically where my Lambda function method was invoked, and I don't have to trace along because the stack trace is part of my logs. Isn't that awesome? Yes? No? Maybe? Or nah, I don't care. The other thing is with traces, because when you're looking at different kinds of invocation, this was one of the examples with the function URL invoking Lambda function and returning a message dynamically. So you can see my client, which is basically Postman or any of my curl or even my browser, right, that invoked the Lambda function with the context, the Lambda function URL with all of the REST headers, and that later invoked my Lambda function itself. So you can build the complete traces to visually look at how did the invocation go. And if this is a happy path, but if there are errors, you can also view where did it error up. Let's talk a little bit more about traces. The tracer utility of PowerTools enables you to capture the Lambda handler, the different methods that you define inside your Lambda functions. Along with it, you can define certain metadata that you want or your organization wants to follow as a practice. So you can start annotating them. Here are some examples where I've added annotations and certain annotations the tracer is available on X-ray. Especially when you're trying to debug. When the Lambda function has like 10 methods that are being invoked internally to the Lambda function, what you could do is you could have different annotations, and when certain annotation errors up, you could have more information about that annotation, which gives you more context, especially while debugging. And also, when you take a look at traces, you can look at the latency that each of these trace had or annotations had. It gives you insights into the performance of your Lambda function because, as developers, we write complex code and it takes time for the Lambda function to execute. So with this, you get an idea, okay, these are certain functions or these are certain methods. I have to go back and optimize, especially when you're taking a look at it in terms of understanding the performance of your Lambda function. While I was talking about metadata, this is how the PowerTools adds metadata into my annotations. So it knows it was a message that came in from my request response from the Lambda functions, the message itself, and different information such as HTTP method, the timestamp, all of it. Let's talk about metrics. When you're looking at your systems, when I say systems, it's your applications or different kinds of workloads or microservices that's running, and you want to understand insights about how is it performing, be it even in terms of the same shopping cart example, where somebody goes in, adds things into shopping cart, removes them from shopping cart, makes a payment, and all of it. You want to capture certain metrics. With the PowerTools metrics utility, you could do this. And this creates the equivalent metrics on CloudWatch metrics. What you could do is you could create your namespace, your dimensions, and whenever you want to increment these metrics, just use the metrics utility with loggers. So how do you do that? Is basically this, where you can import your PowerTools metrics utility and start adding metrics, create dimensions, and you can start logging these metrics. Especially when you do all of these things together, you see the information on CloudWatch metric. I see my time is up, but I will be going a little fast, so yes. When you're using observability, say things such as CloudWatch, not always that's sufficient for most of the applications, but you may want to look at certain things like an observability tool. That's where something like New Relic, the company where I work, comes into picture. Not making a sales pitch from New Relic, but just mentioning it's one of those tools that helps you do it. So PowerTools gives you information about your functions and understanding the internals of your function, but observability tools stitches all of these information for you to understand what went wrong, where did it go wrong, by stitching the complete information using the logs, metrics, and traces. So it's literally the best of the both worlds. When you're using Lambda functions, you could instrument Lambda functions, be it for New Relic, be it something with OpenTelemetry, or there's something called as AWS distro for OpenTelemetry. So you can instrument them using Lambda layers and Lambda extensions, make the required configurations on your environment variables, and that will be exporting your logs, metrics, traces, all the telemetry data into these designed or destined tools. Here's a quick glance at how Lambda function telemetry looks like. You get the number of invocations, the number of cold starts, if there are any errors, if there are any timeouts, cold starts, the exceptions, and also information about any concurrencies that are there. Now, if you take a look at the logs itself, what tools like New Relic or the observability tools does is they also add in more context for your logs so that when the PowerTools adds certain executable information about your Lambda function, this brings in the infrastructure level of information as well. So best, again, of the both worlds, where observability tool and PowerTools giving you more context about this one hello world or a bedrock text generation completion log that is generated. I was talking about traces. So what distributed traces does is basically it stitches all of your traces into information, and this gives you information about what were the invocation, and if the invocation had any logs, the contextual information for these logs alone, so that when you're taking a look at any of these logs, you can say, I want to take a look at that one specific trace and open the logs, look at what of the other additional metadata PowerTools is added so that you have complete context about this one log message that was generated. So you can see here, there's one such with CloudWatch metrics and the metric itself being incremented as per the execution that happens. So a quick recap about what I spoke about is basically telling you with your logs, you need more metadata, more information that tells how's it performing and how's it going along. And with metrics, when you configure the right kind of information that your business needs, that your developer needs, and also understanding the execution at the Lambda function level, you can configure them using dashboards or CloudWatch metrics, or even exporting it to other tools. With traces, you can add in more contextual information, the metadata, which brings the complete story itself. So when you're debugging with logs, metrics, and traces, it gives you the complete story, helping you understand what went wrong, where did it go wrong. Again, structured logs helps you with debugging, giving you information that is more than necessary for you to understand where things are. With tools such as New Relic, gives you the visibility around the complete history or the complete story about how the execution went, not just with the Lambda function, but across services and traces. And lastly, I was talking about the boilerplate frameworks. So with PowerTools, that brings in the best practices for you to build with. So I know we are out of time for questions, but I'm around, and if you have any questions around observability, serverless, cloud, or just want to say a random hi, I'm around here. So see you all. Thank you.